Welcome to the Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. This is a weekly podcast which looks at every aspect of something which has or will at some point affect us all. And that is grief. Whether you've lost a loved one or about to lose someone you know, or perhaps you're simply trying to help someone navigate their grief and don't know where to start or what to say, then perhaps this is the podcast for you. Each week I'll be bringing you different stories and experiences of loss, love, hope and at times humour. On this week's episode of the Grief Pod, I'm joined by Jason Poole. Jason's 24-year-old sister Jennie was murdered by her ex-partner in 2021. Now, since then, Jason has campaigned to implement Jennies Law in a bid to protect other people from known domestic abusers and also to create a register of those with a history or background of coercive control and abuse. Jason, first of all, thank you for coming in today. I know it's a very difficult week as it's Jennie's anniversary on Thursday. It
is, yeah, Thursday, yeah.
Do you want to start by telling us about Jennie?
Yeah, Jennifer was 24. She was a mother of two young children. She was working in a nursing home. She had just finished all her courses. She was at the learning how to drive. She was kind of just the life and soul of everything, you know. She was well known within the community. Like, you know, you couldn't walk anywhere with her because you take 2 hours to do a 10-minute walk, you know, because she'd be stopping talking to everyone. You know, everyone kind of knew her. She was bubbly, she was outgoing, she was kind, caring. I suppose all the traits that you want in a young person or in an adult, and she had them, you know, tenfold. She loved music, she loved dancing, you know. You'd often hear the car before you'd see it driving around the corner because the music would be blaring in the car. And she just had so much time for her kids and made them a priority and always made sure that they were first. And as a sister, I suppose, you know, she was always at the end of the phone if you needed her, or if you just wanted something done, you know, like in work or something like that, you know, you might not be able to get somewhere because of times, she would give you a help, you know, with that kind of stuff. So if she needed something done or you needed your credit union page, you know, you could rely on her because she was about the village or whatever. But yeah, she was just an all-rounder, I think, you know, and I think it's probably one of the traits that you find in a perpetrator. It's that they hone in on those type of people. Yeah,
and especially strong people as well, I've read, because it's the challenge of breaking that person down.
Yeah. And she had all of those, and that's exactly what he did, you know. But that was kind of her in a nutshell, really. She was just a really, really genuine person, you know. And I think that showed in the community when she did die, you know, the people that just come out because everyone knew her and everyone had some kind of connection to her, whether it was in her voluntary work in the youth clubs and summer camps, or whether it was in her paid work or just from our community or our GA club. Everyone knew her, you know.
Now, all of this happened around COVID time.
Yeah.
Jennie had thought that she'd met somebody loving and kind, but that wasn't the case, was
No,
it?
I suppose everyone, I think, when you go into a relationship, that's the kind of things you want. And I suppose perpetrators or abusers, that's the trait that they have at the very beginning, that love bombing. And I'm going to marry you and I'm going to give you the best life and we're going to move to Spain and we're going to, you know, have a great future together. And I suppose they suck them in, don't they? And they kind of really make them hear what they want to hear. And I think there's a passion for these type of girls and women that particularly, like, sometimes they've been in one of those relationships before and they zone in on that and go, well, I'll give the love bombing and I'll do all of those things, and then they strip them down to what they want. And I think that's exactly what happened with Jennifer. You know, he was at the beginning, I assume, that he was all of those things, because Jennifer wouldn't have settled for anything less, you know. She would have never put herself or her children in, I suppose, harm's way of anything. So I would 100% believe that that's exactly what he did. Yeah. And then when he got his feet under the table, that's when he changed. Yeah. And it was too hard, I think, for Jennifer to move back from that because, yes, it was COVID, but also there was no real supports out there. You know, who do you turn to? you know, he turns your family and your friends in most cases against you. That's what they do, you know, and that happened with Jennifer, with her friends, even with us to a degree. You know, we were in COVID, but there was always the, you know, your family don't like me, those kind of things, that try and stop her from going to things, where she'd turn up a lot of times without him. But then the phone would just be getting hockeyed out of it 24/7 and text messages and where are you? Why haven't you come home? So they do manipulate. The abuser does kind of do that.
And sometimes present probably much more differently at the beginning.
Oh, 100%.
Like charming, kind.
Yeah.
And the stories aren't exactly... The stories they tell you are the opposite perhaps of the truth.
100%. And like even with him, like he was in prison for a previous conviction and told everybody he was in Spain. You know, they want you to believe what this persona that they're going to put on. But I think in hindsight, looking at the back at Jennifer's story and looking at the different things on the different occasions that he was in our company, there was definitely signs, there was definitely red flags, but we just didn't know what they were, because nobody does unless you're in that situation. And now I suppose you feel that, oh God, should I have done this or should I said that? But at those times, and people listening here will be saying exactly the same, you know, there's a lot that you don't know. And it's only when you're directly impacted with it, and you completely understand what a red flag is, that you go, oh God, that's what that was. Or, oh, when he was driving her car, oh, when that car key went missing, or, you know, when Jennifer didn't turn up to the family party but her kids were sent, you know, all of those things. Or, you know, at Christmas when he was sitting against the wall eating his dinner and not joining us at the table, or answering the questions for her, like when... They're odd, but at the time you don't see those things.
Yeah.
You know? And that was the coercive control, that was the manipulating, that was the, you know, we didn't obviously know anything about the violent side of things, which there was bruises, there was wounds, but she always had another reason, she always had an excuse for them. You know, she played sport, she had 2 young kids, you know, anyone can get a black eye from playing sport, or anyone can get a black eye if you tell me you chose stuff. And that's what she did. But she was a good liar. You know, in the end of it all, and that's what he'd made her do. He made her become a liar, that she had no choice but to always have a story when she was going out anywhere.
Well, I suppose, like, and this is also part and parcel of your campaign, which we'll get into in a minute. It's with the red flags that now, in the last maybe 3 years, people know about those. They're a word, they're a phrase. Whereas, I think if you go back 4 or 5 years, they weren't.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are talking about it more. I do believe that there was a real increase in numbers during maybe COVID, because a lot of abusers were at home, you know. There is certain times of the year, like Christmas time, where numbers do tend to increase, because perpetrators are at home more. But obviously in COVID, they were home full time. So there was an alarming rise, but we are continuing to see those alarming rises since COVID. Like if you were just to look at last year, over 65,000 calls from the guards last year were domestic violence related. That's over 50% of call outs were domestic violence. So there's 2 ways of looking at it. There's an increase, or people are talking about it and people are aware and people are reporting. And I think, I would hope that it's that people are reporting, and it's not that these cases are continue to rise. I think, you know, there was that fear, and that, you know, what goes on behind closed doors is nobody else's business, and we've moved away from that, and we have seen men, you know, become more of an ally. And even for me, like, we've gone around doing the petitions in the supermarkets and stuff over the last week or 2. It was amazing just to see the amount of men stopping to fill out the petition.
Wow.
Who either they were directly impacted from a sister that had went through it, or they were brought up in that environment where their dad was doing that to their mums, or just genuine guys who thought this should never be happening. Why is this going on? You know, so I think there's a change in culture, as you were saying, but I do think there's a lot more that needs to be done. You know, services are out the door. You know, we're still seeing an alarming rise in cases. And they're just the people who did report last year. Yeah. There's all those who are not reporting, who are still living in that fear of, you know, what will people think of them. And I would think anybody sitting listening to this, you know, the victim is not at fault. You know, even though they're going to be told that they are, and the victim is going to fear that they can't tell anybody. But it is important that they reach out and tell. But it's also important that they reach out and talk to maybe an agency, or have a safety plan put in place, or an exit plan put in place. Because when you do plan to leave, that's when you're most at risk.
Yeah.
And Jennifer and many other women, it was at the end of their relationship or as they finished their relationship is when this happened to them.
Yeah.
So it isn't just, you know, people listening, the word and the sentence I hate is, why don't they just leave? You know, it takes an average 8 to 10 times, and they may never get to the 8 or 10 times, or they may even go longer, but the average is 8 to 10, and they need support. They don't need people, I suppose, looking down at them and saying, "Oh, sure, just go." There's so many obstacles and so many reasons why they can't just go. Some of them is because they have children, some is because there's pets involved, but some of them is just the genuine fear of, "Oh, I can't go and tell my family this is going on." You know, or I can't tell my friends, or this is the reason why I'm not in contact with my friends anymore, but I couldn't tell them. So there's lots of reasons. I think people just need to be more supportive, and I think if we're more supportive and men become more of an ally for this, we will continue to see cases rise, but I think we will see a leveling off of cases, because people will become more aware, I think, and I think that's it. A problem is that people aren't maybe calling it out for what it is, and it's been left to all these services, and the services are flat out and they can't actually cope. But also, you know, for those 65,000 people last year who did go pick up the phone to the guards, what's the next step for them? There's no system.
Yeah, where did they go?
You know, we can't just keep saying, "Oh, ring this number," because they're out the door. You know, so we do need a proper structure. I believe domestic violence cases should have a domestic violence court there where they can be dealing with a judge who might be a little bit more compassionate than what we're seeing in the current justice system. You know, so there's lots of things that can support women, but I think the biggest thing is friendship. You know, and I think as well, for us, just talking about Jennifer's story, you know, the biggest people who've seen the most of Jennifer's story and the bruises and wounds was our work colleagues, because it was the only one place where she was consistent in going. And a lot of times when they gave evidence to the guards, or they were interviewed by the guards, they had seen bruises and wounds, because it was the one place he didn't stop her from going, because it was the financial control. He needed the money coming in. So it was our work colleagues. So if you're sitting and you do think there's a work colleague, you know, that just isn't right, or they're the people who are going to see it more, because he's not going to be in your workplace, or she's not going to be in your workplace. So it's the only place where you probably have that safe haven, where you know. And then the other side of it is where people can pick up on it, because they tend, like Jennifer, they have wounds and bruises, but they'll cover them up. She was a sponsorship for Arnica. You know, we using that much of it to cover our bruises and wounds. We just had no idea. You know,
often when you read about these cases, the people have met online, or they've met through an app, and that's how perhaps, you know, these situations start. But in Jennifer's case, they met through a neighbour. Gavin's cousin actually lived next door to Jennifer, and her and Jennifer were kind of friendly on friend terms, and he was over visiting her, because he wasn't living too far from Jennifer, in his uncle's house, and that's how they met. So they met through the neighbour. It wasn't online, or you know, and you would imagine at that time it would have been more because they were in COVID. Yeah. But clearly this guy was out of prison and was moving around his family, to see where he could get his next pillow. But at this point, Jennie had no idea.
No idea.
He had told her that he'd been in Spain.
Yeah, and so did all his family too. Nobody ever told her.
Nobody, even the cousin didn't know he'd been in.
Well, I'm sure the cousin knew. Yeah. I think all of his family knew, but they just chose not to tell. And I suppose the other side of it, when you look at it, is maybe the fact that, you know, if they got rid of him and off their floor onto somebody else's, it was a job done for them. So I think it was easier maybe not to tell, and hope that the burden would go on to somebody else. And in this case, Jennifer suffered the consequences for that burden. You know,
and because they weren't together that long either.
No, it was just about 13 months in total.
Wow.
But he did move in quite quickly, and within a couple of weeks he was already living in the house. Red flag. But again, we didn't know anything, and it was COVID, and it was, you know, we wouldn't have visited her. She would have always visited us, so you would be up there not as much as she would have been in her house at the time. Particularly, she worked in a nursing home, and she was also trying to protect her own colleagues and her own residents. So, you know, she would have been masked up and all that kind of stuff. So there was always like, oh, I can only...
Which would hide stuff as well.
Yeah, and I can only come in for a few minutes. And you'd be like, Jennifer, you used to come in for ages. Like you know, you're running in and out. But the phone would be going, and sure, we would be like, oh, sure. you know, it's Gavin, or I have to go and get this, or I have to go and get that. So there was always, she was a good liar at the end of it all, to protect herself and to protect the situation, and maybe to protect him in somewhat, so that there wouldn't be challenges, or there wouldn't be, you know, I'm going up and I'm going to remove him from the home. And we did go up once, and she took him back, because it's that cycle, isn't it? You know?
So there was, in that time, how long did it take before you started to realise that something wasn't right?
I didn't like him from the very first time I met him. I just thought there was something not right about him. There was, you know, he always wanted to be better and always have a better conversation, always have a better story, always knew somebody better. I just thought, you know what, Jesus, I just couldn't be dealing with you. You know, there's too much going on in this world to be listening to stupidity.
Yeah.
But to answer the question, when did I feel there was something going on? There was a time when she had a black eye, and I asked her, and she told me that her son had hit it with an Avengers toy. And then I said to the little lad, you know, did you do that to your mummy? And he said no. And I was like, okay, but then again, he was 3, so he's not going to tell you, really, is he?
Yeah.
But it was the first time that I thought, you know, that's just not right,
fishy.
you know.
Yeah.
And then I suppose I didn't really pay attention. Not that I didn't pay attention, but I didn't really pay attention to what could have been going on, because I didn't think anything would be going on, because I didn't think Jennifer would allow that.
Yeah.
I thought she was such a strong person. Like, if you seen Jennifer on the football pitch, she, no matter what size you were, you didn't get by her. You know, she was hard soul on the pitch.
Yeah.
And she portrayed that in her life off the pitch. You know, she was very, very focused. If she put her hand to something, she achieved it. So I just never thought that Jennifer would be allowing something like that to happen in her life. So I didn't have those questions in my head going, could that be? Because I just would have assumed that Jennifer wouldn't have allowed it. But by God, was it going on tenfold, and we didn't know anything. Yeah. The only time we knew anything was happening was when the kids were being interviewed by the guards in preparation for trial. And
the kids were in and out of your house during this time while Jennifer was working in the nursing home. Yeah. Did their sort of behaviour or their demeanour change? Because they were obviously around this.
Yeah, and they were witnessing it, and they were seeing it, and they were part of it, but they didn't. Because I believe Jennifer told them, you don't tell them, you know. And if you ever questioned anything, you kind of got that stern look, you know, can I say what I really think? And I suppose that was a situation that they were put in to protect them. But I do think the reason why was when the children were interviewed by the guards, they did tell the guards that particularly the older of the two, which at the time was only 6, 7, was that Gavin used to tell my mammy that if she said anything that he would hurt the family. So she was protecting everybody. The kids were protecting everybody, because he was threatening us. So she was taking the brunt of all of that, as well as everything else. You know, so he had really manipulated her so that she could never tell. And I believe at this point, she probably did know that he was very violent and what he was capable of, because it was happening to her. So she knew, I can't put my family through this, so I'm just going to take the brunt of it. And that's what she did. And she got the courage to leave. And last time.
At what point was that? Because obviously this all escalated very quickly. As we were saying, it was a year or so they were going out. He moved in. Everything was starting to happen. Tell me about towards the end how it sort of escalated and got to the point where Jennifer was leaving. She had left him. Yeah.
I suppose what we found out afterwards is that she had tried a number of times for him to leave, which kind of goes inside with what we would hear from any domestic violence agency, that average time. So we were told by the neighbour that there had been times where she had removed him and he kept coming back, and of course she felt sorry for him and she could fix him and make him better, and she continued to do that. On the time that she actually left, she had just, I believe, had enough of him, and she packed everything that belonged to him and she had removed him from the home. He was gone about a week, and I suppose he was still in contact somewhat with her, but she had told us that you know, I'm done with Gavin. I can't go back there. He needs help. I need to look after myself and my kids and our futures, and I really don't want him back in my life. And that was the Wednesday. I had a good conversation with her. She was buying a new television. In hindsight, he had broke or smashed the television, which we didn't know. And she was looking to buy a new television, and I had sent her the money for the telly, and she was to go to Power City to get the television. And on the Friday, I had rang her, and she was like, "Oh, I'm going to go out with my friends tonight." They were going to get milkshakes and Eddie Rockets, and she said, "Will you mind the kids?" And I said, "Yeah, no problem at all." I said, "Did you get the telly?" "Yeah." And she was like, "Look, I'm done with him. I need to move on now." And we had a good conversation about that. I said to her, "Well, I'll help you do whatever, and she wanted to go and do another level in the course that she was doing, and she really was just. So it was just a normal conversation. And I went from seeing Jennifer on the previous week that looked like someone had been dragged through a thorn bush to seeing her on Friday with her makeup done and her hair done, and she was going for milkshakes. But it was like she had got a little bit of herself back, and she was ready to go out and just be with her friends again. And it was great that her friends were straight away back there, that they didn't turn on her. Because I think that's the worst thing that can happen, because nobody knows what is going on, and sometimes you do lose the friends because of those situations, because they manipulate that for that to happen. And she went out with her friends, and that was fine. On the Saturday morning, she got a call from him. He said he needed a shower. There was no hot water in the house. Could he come and have a shower? And of course she let him in to have the shower, but she left the apartment while he was having the shower. And I believe there probably was words, and that's probably why she left and allowed him to have the shower. And she said, "I'll be back. You make sure you're gone when I come back." And she rang the neighbour. The neighbour said that she couldn't hear any noise, that it sounded like he was gone. And Jennifer went back. In the meantime, we were going to go to the beach. So she was going back to get clothes. And the kids were with you at this point? One of the kids was with my mum and sister, and one was with Jennifer.
Okay.
He was in the car with her, and Jennifer flew in to get a change of clothes to go to the beach. And when she went in, he was still there, but she never made it out from behind the hall door. So he was there waiting on her. She died literally behind the hall door. So he was waiting.
She walked into the hall door.
He locked the door behind her, and he stabbed her to death behind the hall door.
And where was her?
He was on the other side of the door. He was in the car initially, and then he heard a commotion from the neighbour, and he was on the top of the steps, so he could hear everything. He could hear his mammy crying for help, and told the guards he could hear his mammy crying for her mammy. And they were his last memories of his mammy. He also seen Gavin jump on the balcony and was able to tell the guards the direction in which he went in, and this was a 4-year-old, but that was kind of the day. Then it kind of, the neighbour witnessed it all. Gavin was standing over Jennifer just in his underwear, like it was premeditated. He knew, I don't want to get blood on my clothes, I want to be able to walk out here. He cleaned the knife before he left. He was prepared. He knew what he was about to do. He had slashed all Jennifer's pictures on her walls of her and her children. Like he had went on a rage because he knew Jennifer wasn't taking him back, and that was it. And he had lost control. He'd lost the power. And there's that one last time. And if we look at the many cases, it's that one last time that, I want to return this, or I want to give you this, or I want to drop over to say goodbye.
That's their opportunity.
That's their opportunity to seize that moment. And that's exactly what happened with Jennifer.
So he stabs your sister.
Mm-hmm.
Her little boy, who's 4, is the other side of the door. Who calls for help?
The neighbour eventually calls the guards, and the guards arrive very, very quickly.
Were they aware already that there was issues? Had she ever reached out?
From my understanding, the guards had been in her house before, from neighbours reporting. But again, there's nothing for the guards to tell. But in this particular case, yes, I believe the guards were there before, and they arrived that day not because they were aware. I think they just were close by, you know. Like Jennifer went up the stairs on CCTV at I think it was 1:57, and at 2:07 Jennifer was dead. The first guard car was already there. He had locked the door from the inside. The guards couldn't get in with the key, so they had to break in the door. But it all happened so quickly, and she was already dead. Because when we got to the hospital, the doctor told us that she was dead on arrival. So she was already dead. No, in fairness to the paramedics and the fire brigade, you couldn't thank them enough. You know, they really tried in the house to work on her, but there was nothing that they could do. She had wounds to the back and the front, and she was, you know, she had a lot of injuries.
You get that call then? Or?
I got the call from my sister. My sister she wasn't, Jennifer I don't think was answering her phone, and Claire went up to the apartment, and when they drove into the estate, there was just police cars everywhere.
So nobody actually had called?
No.
That was pure chance?
Pure chance that we went up. Fire brigades everywhere, ambulance. And when Claire got out of the car, the neighbour said, Jennifer's after being stabbed. At this point, we didn't know anything. You know, we just thought, oh, she's been stabbed. Not that it's own, but it was like, she's grand in there.
Yeah.
And we just assumed that the police wouldn't let us in because it was COVID, and that the paramedics were in there, and that social distancing thing.
Yeah.
And Claire rang me and she said, oh, Jennifer's after being stabbed. I was literally going to come across the N50. So I was like, okay, where are you? And it was just that back and forward, you know, that panic mode, but not thinking the worst. Thinking, oh, she's grand, you know. And then Claire rang again and she said they're taking her out. She's on the stretcher, and they're bringing her to Connolly Hospital. I was like, okay, I'll go straight to Connolly. And again, thinking, well, she must be okay, because when you see on the news a lot of times when something happens to somebody, they tend to leave the body at the scene, you know, or the state pathologist will arrive to the house so I never thought of that, because I straight away went into that mode. Well, she must be all right if they're bringing her to hospital. But when I got to Connolly, it was a very different situation. Do you know when you just get out of the car and you see the guards are sitting at one door, and they weren't letting me in that door, and they were like, oh, you go to reception. And just when I got to reception, I just felt, you know, oh, when I gave her name, there was that pause, and oh, someone will be with you now. And they just brought me into a room same size as this with a couch in it, and the doctor came in and she was like, your sister's dead. I was like, no, she couldn't be. Like, what are you in here telling me for? Go back in and work on her, like, you know. I couldn't. And her words were like she was dead on arrival. So they took her out of the house to give her the best shot, and they continued to work on her in the ambulance, but their wounds were too severe. So that's kind of I suppose the story of the never assume maybe that when somebody's taken out that they're okay, because that's what I just assumed, because it's when you see things in the news and the media, normally when somebody dies in circumstances, they're left at the scene. So your perception is, well, she must be okay. I was never going into that room thinking that I was going to be told what I was being told, and then I never for the life of me thought I'd have to go in and look at her afterwards. You know, that was just, you know, the family had started to arrive, and we had to ring. My dad was on the way back from Wexford. I had to ring him. I was like, don't come to Connolly Hospital, Jennifer's already dead. They're not allowing us anywhere near her. And then the guards had said to me, you know, you seem to be able to manage the situation and you're controlling your family well. Would you mind identifying your sister's body? And I was like, when? They were like, now. I was like, what? Like this. And they said, but you need to get rid of the rest of your family first. They have to go. We can't have them around here. So I got everybody into cars and got everybody home, and I went in, and it was the horriblest thing having to do ever, I think, because not only was it, she was still warm, but you weren't allowed to touch her, you weren't allowed to say goodbye, because she was evidence. You just had to stand there and look at her like that, and you know, just ask those questions on, you know, what's your relationship to her and what's her date of birth, and can you identify her by her name? And I'm like, of course I can. But it's something that you don't want any family to ever have to go through. It was horrific. It's still the images that I have. I don't think they'll ever go. But also it's important that, you know, that people realise this isn't every family, but there is families, and I suppose that's why we have done so much to make sure that others don't have to go through that. But it was horrific. The day was horrific. The aftermath was horrific. And in
the centre of this as well, there's two little
kids who you're trying to protect, and also like the amount of court dates and court appearances, and you know, and you're preparing for trial. Like we were interviewed for hours in Garda stations in the 2 days after Jennifer died, all of us, you know, and that you never felt you got time as a family maybe to even sit down and go, oh my God, what happened? Because you're automatically kicking into that mode. You're automatically kicking in, well, where is he? Have they arrested him? Has he been charged? You know, you've that 48 hours that you're sitting on the edge of your seat waiting on that call to see if the DPP have enough evidence, even though in your own heart and soul you know he did it, but they're innocent until proven guilty. So you know you've that, and then you've the different days in court, and then you're preparing for trial, and you just never stopped. You never got to grieve the
way you would
with a normal
normal
death. I suppose everything is not normal, but like, you know, for someone who maybe had died of a natural cause or something like that, you have that time and you can have that space. You weren't dragged straight to Garda stations for interviews, or you know, and then the community were holding different vigils and different events, and you were doing your very best to kind of put that front forward and be there for all of those, because that was their opportunity to show us, I suppose, as a family that they cared. So you were doing your best to kind of be there and to be up and do what was required of you for Jennifer, really, you know. But in the meantime, it was like your whole life had just been turned upside down. Well, it had been turned upside down, but just not getting time, you know. And then you were preparing for a funeral that you didn't know when you were going to get her body back, because, you know, you've a post-mortem, and then he has a decision whether he would like another one. You're like, people don't understand when you go through this, even after somebody has murdered somebody, the power that they still hold all the way through.
So
trial. His legal team
had a decision, a choice.
Yeah, whether there would be a second post-mortem. Why? Because of obviously his legal team, and because if there was any discrepancies in the first post-mortem. So you're sitting there waiting, does he want another one, does he not? Can we plan a funeral, can we not? You know, even at that point, after he did what he has control. And this is it, domestic violence is all about control. And even when they murder somebody, they still have control. They have control right up to the end. Our final day in court, our sentencing day, we had to submit our victim impact statements to his legal team for him to read, to see if he was happy with them, or was there anything he'd want taken out. Like even at the end of trial, when he's been sentenced for the murder, he is still in control. So they don't lose that control, you know. And that's just the nature of our justice system. But it just, in a domestic violence case, that person has held control, has lost control by the perpetrator being removed away from the victim, come back, do what they done, and then they gain that control again. They got control over. He got control, and his legal team got control over our whole family, of what we were allowed to say and what we were allowed to do.
Has there ever been any remorse?
Never remorse. You know, to the fact, not even that there wasn't remorse, he actually believed that a court or a judge or a jury or a guard would believe that Jennifer came after him with a knife. That was his line. It was self-defence. She came at me with a knife, and I blacked out and I lost control. She never made it from behind the hall door. Our kitchen wasn't in the hall door. She never moved from behind the hall door. She was found behind the hall door.
And her child was on the other side.
And her child was on the other side.
You have campaigned relentlessly for Jennies Law, which is similar to what there is in the UK. There's Clare's Law in the UK. So there's a register of domestic abusers, coercive controls, where people can go if they're starting a new relationship to know, was this person really in Spain or were they, you know, in jail?
Yeah.
So in a way to try and help people obviously not get into these situations. Where are you with it now? 4 years.
I suppose we've been campaigning and we've done a lot of work on it. Primarily it was around Jennifer's story and other victims who have died. But also speaking to victims who have been lucky enough to be able to manage to get away from it, that there was a real need that, you know, we've all these services and everything is brilliant, but nobody knows the past of the perpetrator. And in Jennifer's case, he was in prison for a previous conviction of domestic violence with an ex-partner.
And am I right in saying that while this was going on, you're waiting for trial for Jennifer, he was also waiting for other
charges that we weren't aware for assaults.
So there was a litany of which could have been avoided should there be this register.
100%. But also the register is important because for Jennifer and many others, there's that it would create that right to ask, the right to tell. So in all those times that the guards did arrive, you know, that they would have been able to say, well, actually this person has a previous, the register would only work in a way that it would have to have a previous conviction. So it isn't like anybody can go onto this register, and it isn't that, oh, I can go onto Google and find anybody, which I think there is a certain perception in Ireland to believe that that's the way it is. It would have to be that you've been in front of a judge and you have been given a conviction, because a lot of what we're seeing now is even that there's people who are in domestic violence relationships, they're taking cases to court and they're being given suspended sentences. So even if there is a case where there's a suspended sentence, but it would give the justice system and the judges the power to put these people onto a register. So it may not be the ideal situation for the person that was in that situation and that they didn't feel that the person went to prison, but it will protect the people coming along after that. Like Gavin had not only one, he had several partners who all come out and spoke to us as a family after Jennifer died, that he had done very similar things to them. Even when he was in prison for murdering Jennifer, he couldn't manage himself. He was attacking prisoners. He was wrecking the cell. He's been in more prisons in the last 4 years than most people have done in their whole life. You know, he's been moved from Clover Hill to Mountjoy to Portlaoise to Cork, because anytime you ask them, they keep telling you, well, it's for the smooth running of the prison. So even behind bars, he can't manage himself. You know, so this person's never ever going to change. And to think that he's 4 years into his life sentence, which is the average of 22 years, that in 18 years he could be out and it could be somebody else's daughter that he will find. You know, so what we were looking for is a domestic violence register where there would be the right to ask, a right to tell, where a victim would also be able to go into a Garda station and say, look, something's not right. I feel there's a couple of red flags. I'm not sure of what I can do, but I want to check and see if this person has a previous conviction. So it's protection.
That would be the one thing that, you know, with situations like this and people like this, the victim, as we were saying, doesn't want to believe them. So it's also about encouraging people to check.
100%. And I think the checking part is really, really important, because you also might find that the person isn't on it, because and that's okay, because they have never been convicted or nobody has ever taken that. And that's why it's important that it happens locally, in a Garda station maybe, where we would see domestic violence units in every Garda station where there's guards are trained in that area. Because let's be real, if you were to go in front of a judge in any court, well, the courts that I've heard stories from in Dublin, you know, the judges are not very nice. You know, they're asking you, where's your bruises, where's your wounds, where's your evidence? And that might be 7 hours later when you're called. You know, a victim doesn't have 7 hours. They're being watched on the doorbell cameras. They're being watched everywhere. They don't have that time. So they need somewhere that's local that they can go to. And I think the idea would be their local Garda station. So having this centralised and having a domestic violence unit in every Garda station, whether it's a unit of 1, 2, 3 or 10, depending on the needs, but that there would be people there trained. I've seen guards, I've talked to guards coming out of Templemore, you know, a conversation is had around domestic violence. There's no proper training, as even though we are being told there is. You know, there isn't proper training, and it's not they're not being prepared. And when I spoke to the Garda Commissioner at a Women's Aid event, and I was told, yeah, but like a lot of these are young guards on the ground and they've 14, 15 other call-outs. That's not my problem. That's not the victim's problem. That's a Garda recruitment problem, you know. And we can't not bring in a domestic violence register because we don't have the guards to manpower. So what, we just kind of let all
And
these
is that
people
the biggest
die?
hindrance at the moment to this coming in? Is that what's
I think
stalling it in a way?
It's been a couple of different things under the previous government. I had got to stage 2 and about to go to stage 3 through the houses. There was a lot of need from the minister at the beginning, and a lot of commitment, and then it kind of was getting diluted every time. We were told it wasn't constitutional, you know, so, and, you know, having something like that is not really ideal. But yeah, if I'm a journalist or I'm a member of the public, I can walk into any of those courts and I could write it up on any social media page, or I could report it. So the only stories we're hearing is where journalists were actually doing it. And that was my argument with them. Like, this is just doesn't make sense. We have it like in Northern Ireland, we've Clare's Law, we have it in the UK, and from people that I've spoke to, it works. They've been saved by this system. So I had worked then with Jim O'Callaghan and Senator Fiona O'Loughlin, and my local TD Paul McAuliffe, and we've been working in the background on I suppose a Fianna Fáil policy document on domestic violence, and it was put together as a private members bill with Jim and Fiona. So we kind of had been working in the background a lot on it, and then obviously the general election was called, so it felt like I'm going from scratch again. But on the other side, we were lucky enough that Jim O'Callaghan has been given the ministerial position, and had wrote the policy document, and it's been in the Fianna Fáil manifesto. It's now in the programme for government that a domestic violence register. He's publicly talked about it in the last couple of months. He's talked about it in the Dáil, and he's talked about it on numerous of radio and TV. So there's a plan for it. My I suppose issue is around, since the government have been formed, we still have had women die at the hands of violence against men. So this isn't something that needs to come in year 5 when we're calling for the next general election for, you know, more votes. This is something that needs to happen now, and I think it will strengthen the powers of the guards, I think, when it deals with domestic violence, because they will be able to, I suppose, go in and rather than the woman and the children in some cases having to leave, that it would give the guards the power to remove the perpetrator, you know, from the home. And it does happen already in some cases, but in most of the cases it's not, and that's why we're seeing a massive increase in the amount of refuges and the amount of beds that are required, because it's still the women and the children who are leaving. And unfortunately we need to change the culture that it's the man who's been removed, you know, and the woman and children are left in that safe environment. And in some cases, you know, it is men that having to deal with this, and it isn't, you know, all women who are victims. So again, there needs to be supports if it is a man, and how does that look for them? So it has to be there for both. But I do think it's something that is there. In theory, the biggest problem I think we're facing now is to get the Attorney General on board, to make sure that whatever is implemented correctly, and that there isn't any loopholes in the system. And because we are looking for it to be called after Jennifer, it requires new legislation. It can't be a new or an existing legislation with an amendment to it. So that's taken time. But there is a commitment. I plan to meet Jim O'Callaghan in the next couple of weeks. But at the moment we're looking at, we've kind of had this burst within the campaign. We've got like different programs on social media. We've done some campaigns around with the cars and, you know, the stickers on people's cars. We've been doing online petitions. We've been in supermarkets, and just really getting the support that this isn't just one family who believes this. This isn't just families who have went through this, but actually a lot of people are going through this. And what's really alarming is been in those supermarkets over the last week or two, and the amount of women particularly who are victims or have been victims of domestic violence, and who are so calling out for this as well. That there's people, I was in the pavilions in Swords yesterday, and people coming up to me and you're asking, why isn't this already a legislation in Ireland? People from outside of Ireland. There was two different people who were over visiting family, and they were talking about Clare's Law. and how one of them had been protected, and is probably the only reason she said she's still alive is because of Clare's Law. Yet we have a government who have sat on their hands for years. This isn't something that's just happened in the last 2-3 years. Domestic violence has always been there. It's never been talked about, you know. And I'm a little bit more concerned that it's taken so long. I'm concerned that there's members of government and members within the higher remit of government who still think that this is not needed. You know, how can something that's, you know, going to save lives and protect women and
not
men
be needed, not
needed?
Especially for future.
Yeah, like it isn't like we are living a life sentence. We'll never get Jennifer back. All we are trying to do is to ensure that other families do not have to go through what we're going through, that they won't have to do what we've had to do. And it's a shame that the government don't see that it shouldn't take a family who are in mourning and grief to actually try put something together. That this should automatically be, and there should be support from the whole of government. And to think that there isn't, you know, like when you talk like a previous government, when you think about the amount of times I went into that Department of Justice, the amount of times I was in Dáil Éireann and nothing materialised. It's all, yes, we will, but nothing ever materialised. And there was empty promises all the time. And I do genuinely believe they thought I was just going to go away. But I'm not going to go away. If anything, they've actually made me more angry at the system. They've made me more angry at them. And as I told them already, if I'm not inside sitting at your table and discussing this, I'll be outside. And we've nearly 30,000 signatures on the petition already. And I can imagine they won't be closing off Kildare Street. They'll be closing off the city centre with the people who will turn up, because it is a massive issue, and every single person knows somebody who has been affected by it or will be affected by it, because it's such an issue at the moment that, you know, it's needed. And I think it's needed now, because if not, other people are going to have to suffer, and people are going to suffer because of this. This
week is 4 years.
4 years on Thursday, yeah.
Yeah, since you lost Jennie. Is there something you do as a family to mark that day? Or is it a day where you feel, I mean, obviously you can't celebrate, but you want to celebrate her and her life?
I suppose what we try to do, since Jennifer died, every year we've done some sort of an event to raise awareness and to raise money for domestic violence charities. And so the last 3 years we had we done like a charity evening. Last year we did, the year before that we did the Stairway to Heaven. Last year they did the Women's Mini Marathon. And this year we're actually extending it out. We're not having it in April. We're doing a golf classic in June on Father's Day. And I think it's to really highlight domestic violence, but through I suppose a sport that are predominantly male. And we hope to raise awareness for that. But on the actual day itself, we kind of, as a family, we go down to the grave at a particular time of the day. We'll have some prayers. We kind of do just a prayer ourselves. We'll bring some music or songs that she liked, and we'll play them, and we'll spend about an hour or two just in the graveyard, and then we tend to go back to my mum's, and we just have like a tea and some sandwiches, and just kind of spend the day together. But also protecting the children, because it's getting difficult for them now. I think particularly the older one is 11. She understands it a lot more. She has more questions than she had before, I think. And the young lad, his communion is soon, so you know it's triggering times, and like no matter what, they'll never forget. Because they were also part of it. They were also traumatised, not only through her death, but also through the actions of Gavin. And like some of the stories that they told the guards of what he did to the three of them, you know, when Jennifer would be in the house and he'd lock the three of them in the rooms, and he'd be doing like, so they've experienced a lot of trauma, and they are and have got a lot of support from different agencies, and they've gone to counselling, and their school is very good with them. But you know, like Mother's Day was only a few weeks ago, and everyone was running out of school with their mummy's day cards, and theirs is to be brought down to their graveyard, you know. And it's those moments where you go, this just isn't right. Little kids like that should not have to grow up without their mammy. Should not have to witness what they witnessed. Should not have to see their mammy put down a hole. They shouldn't. And it's happened to too many families. It's happened to too many kids where their loss of their loved ones is traumatising for them. And we will do everything in our power to make sure that they grow up knowing that domestic violence is not okay. Because I do think there's a massive, massive cultural issue in relation to the young people growing up. I think there's a massive piece that's needed in education, because young children are growing up believing that this is okay. And I'm a secondary school teacher, and I'm working on all boys school, and I see it. I see the likes of these social media influencers and the impact that they can have. There's a massive piece of work need to be done with both boys and girls, that those relationships are not healthy. I was speaking to one woman yesterday, and this was going on, domestic violence with our 13-year-old daughter. 13. Wow. And the daughter was allowing it to happen because she just assumed that this was normal behaviour, until she was told no, it wasn't. So we do need to shape the minds of the generation coming behind us, though otherwise what we're doing now and the impact that we're trying to create is not going to have anything, because it's becoming more normalised. And I do think men have a massive role, particularly, to play in calling it out for what it is. And more men need to support women in these situations. Whether it's on a night out or you see something happening, or instead of participating in something in a WhatsApp group, call it out and say, this is not okay. I don't appreciate that comment, or I don't appreciate that image, and say it. And sometimes people put things into groups and stuff, and they don't, or having conversations, and they don't see the harm in it. But it is harming, because it's creating that culture that it's okay to treat women like they're pieces of meat, or to abuse women, or to assault women, or to control them in a way that they're being controlled. It's a whole of society approach, and I think the domestic violence register is one aspect of it, but we need to have a full set of wraparound supports. When I just think of the amount of times that Jennifer presented to A&E that we did not know about until we were in trial, and the amount of times that she went with there when she had bruises or wounds, and she told me she fell down the stairs. She lived in an apartment. She didn't have stairs. So those alarm bells, when you see someone coming 5 or 6 times, and you just think, Jesus, those conversations, like she was being put to sleep. The kids told us that Gavin used to put their mammy to sleep on the floor. But Jennifer spent a week in hospital and had a loop recorder fitted in and was wearing a monitor. She didn't need it. There was nothing wrong. The reason they put them in, because they couldn't find anything wrong. And they were trying to monitor her heart, thinking, there might be something wrong with the heart. There was nothing wrong with her heart. The post-mortem report proved there was something wrong with her heart. But again, that was him doing what he had done. And when she went in, she made up a story. So the doctors and the nurse in the hospital were like, well, we can't find that wrong, so we'll stick a loop recorder in and see if there's anything. But there was never going to be anything on the loop recorder, because there was nothing wrong. He was knocking her out unconscious, and she was going getting herself checked in the hospital afterwards. And this is what's going on. And I think the wraparound supports need to be hospitals, the guards, everyone working together, services, Tulsa, have a massive role, not one that's victim blaming or pointing the finger, one that's of a supportive nature. And that's what I think in relation to domestic violence register, that if a victim is informed that the person they're living with is on a register, that it isn't, let's get Tulsa involved now. It has to be one of support, because they're still going to take weeks or months before that person may actually leave. And in that time frame, it's about supporting. The schools are doing a massive amount of work in this area. Lots of schools are and just challenging men and boys on that behaviour and bringing in speakers and stuff. But again, it has to be a whole approach. And maybe the Department of Education need to come out and actually this plan that they have been talking about for 2 years, that they told me was in play, now needs to be implemented. Because it's not going to change unless we do something about it.
No. Jason, thank you so much.
No problem at all.
And obviously, I think everyone's agreed Jennie's Law needs to happen, and hopefully that will be in place very, very soon.
Thanks very much. Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. You can listen on SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts. We also have an online community on Facebook, The Grief Pod, or on Instagram at Grief Pod Series.